33 kilometers. That is all that stands between the global economy and an energy catastrophe. And right now, almost nothing is moving through it. Welcome back to Global Conflict Feed. I'm David. And what we are about to walk through is not just a Middle East story. This is a story about oil, war, a fragile ceasefire that may already be cracking, and 14 days that could redefine how the world's most dangerous region is governed. Here's what you need to know before we go further. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is effectively a valve on the global energy supply. And right now, Iran's hand is on that valve. Let's start with the geography, because the scale of this corridor will surprise you. Nestled between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, the Strait of Hormuz funnels approximately 1/5 of all the oil produced on Earth through a passage barely wider than a mid-sized city. Add to that nearly 1/3 of the planet's liquefied natural gas and a significant portion of global fertilizer exports, and you begin to understand why a disruption here does not stay regional. It spreads. Within weeks, you feel it at the gas pump, at the grocery store, in the cost of every plastic product you own. So what happens when that corridor goes quiet? You are watching it happen right now. Before the war, somewhere between 100 and 120 commercial vessels threaded through the strait every single day. As of the latest reporting, fewer than a dozen have passed since the ceasefire was declared. 6 cargo carriers, 1 Chinese-owned oil tanker, and a single Gabon-flagged vessel carrying around 7,000 tons of Emirati fuel oil bound for India. That was the first non-Iranian oil tanker to transit the waterway after the truce. 1 ship. That is not an open strait. That is theater. And that is the central tension at the heart of everything unfolding right now. Because here is how we arrived at this moment. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign against Iran's military infrastructure, nuclear sites, and command networks. Within 40 days, the operation, which the Pentagon called Operation Epic Fury, produced a press conference at which the defense secretary declared Iran had been rendered combat ineffective for years to come. Definitive, total victory. Except Iran did not fold. What Iran did was close the strait. Not a full shutdown, but enough to throttle global energy flows. West Texas Intermediate crude surged past $90 a barrel. Shipping firms began routing vessels around the Cape of Good Hope rather than risk the passage. Insurance companies refused to write coverage for transit. The financial pain was immediate and global. Then came the announcement almost no one anticipated. On April 8th, President Trump declared a 2-week ceasefire, posting to social media that the United States had met all military objectives and was, in his own framing, far along on a lasting peace framework. The opening condition: Iran must fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's Supreme National Security Council confirmed the arrangement almost immediately. But here is where the story becomes genuinely alarming, because both sides confirmed an agreement that describes 2 completely different realities. According to Tehran, channeled through a semi-official outlet affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, the deal preserved continued Iranian authority over the strait. Washington did not confirm that at any point. What followed was the pattern that now defines this entire ceasefire: 2 governments, 1 agreement, and entirely separate victories claimed. The strait itself tells you what is actually happening. Iran announced it would permit no more than 15 vessels per day to transit and would charge commercial tolls, with revenue earmarked for post-war reconstruction. President Trump fired back publicly, warning Iran not to charge tankers, demanding the waterway be opened without restriction. Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Hegseth stood at a briefing and said flatly, "The strait is open." The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when pressed, offered this: "I believe so based on the diplomatic negotiation." I believe so. That is the level of confidence on the ground. And then things deteriorated further, because there is a second war happening inside this ceasefire. Hezbollah, Iran's most heavily funded proxy force, based in southern Lebanon, had been launching rockets at Israel since shortly after the initial campaign began. The logic was solidarity. When Iran is at war, Hezbollah goes to war. That arrangement is not informal, it is structural. Iran has bankrolled Hezbollah's weapons, salaries, and operations for years. They are not separate actors. They are one strategy. Israel responded to the rocket fire. The response that came on the Wednesday following the ceasefire was, by any measure, the single largest set of strikes during the entire 40-day conflict. Lebanese health authorities reported at least 254 deaths, with some tallies exceeding 300. A single apartment building strike in Beirut killed more than 200 civilians in an area where no evacuation notice had been issued. Over 1,000 people were reported injured in that one day alone. The question this raised was immediate and incendiary. Was Lebanon covered under the ceasefire or not? Look at what President Trump actually wrote when announcing the deal. Lebanon is not mentioned, not once. But read the statement from Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, the key mediator in these talks, and you find in the third line an explicit reference to an immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon. Iran seized on Sharif's statement instantly. The Revolutionary Guard cited the Beirut strikes as justification for suspending shipping through the strait again. Iranian officials began openly questioning whether showing up to talks was worth it. Vice President Vance pushed back directly. He called it a genuine misunderstanding. He said Iran had mistakenly believed Lebanon was included. He described the Lebanon conflict as a separate skirmish, and he said, and this matters, that Iran would be acting against its own interests if it let the peace framework collapse over it. Meanwhile, David Miliband, head of the International Rescue Committee, described conditions on the Lebanese ground in terms that cut through all the geopolitical maneuvering. He spoke of anger in every direction, at Hezbollah for drawing the country into the conflict, at Israel for how it has conducted its campaign, at the United States, at Europe. He pointed out that his own organization was forced to cut Lebanon staff from 220 people down to 105 because of international funding reductions. He cited new research suggesting that a year of aid cuts has measurably increased global conflict levels by roughly 5%. The Lebanese government does not support Hezbollah. The Lebanese population, in its majority, does not want this war. They are, in Miliband's framing, a silent emergency, caught between forces they did not invite and a world that has substantially stopped paying attention. Now let's address the single most confusing element of this entire crisis: the 10-point peace plan. Because there are not 10 points. There are 3 versions of them. Vice President Vance laid this out with unusual candor. The first version submitted to American negotiators was, in his characterization, so poorly constructed it appeared to have been generated by an AI chatbot. It was immediately rejected. The second version emerged from genuine back-and-forth dialogue and is reportedly the document President Trump described as a workable starting point. The third version, the one being reported on most widely, appeared on Iranian social media and state television. It contains maximalist demands far beyond what the actual negotiating document includes. Why does this matter? Because it is not just a communications problem. It is a window into the internal divisions fracturing Iran right now. Iran is not a unified actor. It never has been. You have the official government, committed, at least publicly, to negotiation. You have the Revolutionary Guard, a military political power structure that gained substantial influence during this war and whose senior commanders have real incentive to see it continue. A peace deal threatens their expanded reach, and you have hardline factions at the fringe who reject American engagement in any form. The ceasefire is holding not because all of Tehran supports it, but because the faction currently at the top of the decision chain has, for now, decided it serves their interests. That calculus can shift quickly. Let's talk about the economic dimension, because the financial stakes here are staggering. When the ceasefire was announced on Tuesday evening, West Texas Intermediate crude collapsed 16% in a single session, settling near $94 per barrel. The Dow Jones recorded its strongest single day in over a year. Futures pointed to a strong open across global markets. By Thursday, that relief was evaporating. As doubt spread about whether the strait was genuinely reopening, crude climbed back above $96. Markets in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Seoul all fell. Investors are now tracking every vessel that enters the strait, the way they once tracked employment reports. 33 kilometers of ocean, 1/5 of the world's oil. The valve is still in Tehran's hands. California, to give one concrete example, imports roughly 75% of its crude oil, with nearly a third sourced from the Middle East. The consequences of a prolonged disruption in the strait are not abstract. They appear at the gas station, in heating bills, in the price of fertilizer and manufactured goods. Gulf states closest to the crisis are directly exposed. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, built precisely to bypass the strait, was reportedly damaged in recent attacks. Kuwait accused Iran and allied forces of drone strikes on its territory even after the ceasefire announcement. Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates both reported strikes during the truce window. A joint statement from Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and several other European governments called for rapid progress on a negotiated settlement and explicitly endorsed extending the ceasefire to Lebanon, aligning Europe with Tehran's interpretation, not Washington's. South Korea, home to roughly 28,000 American troops and heavily dependent on Middle Eastern energy, dispatched a special envoy to Tehran to negotiate safe passage for its commercial vessels. And then there is this detail, sourced from regional reporting. Iran may have deployed sea mines in the waterway while simultaneously offering alternative routing for the few ships it is permitting to transit. If accurate, that is not the behavior of a nation that has reopened a strait. That is the behavior of a nation that controls one. To understand why Iran governs by defiance, you have to go further back than 1979. You have to go back to the Qajar dynasty, to the Anglo-Russian partition of Iran in 1907, to the CIA-backed removal of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. Decades of foreign interference have produced a governing philosophy defined by one organizing principle: no outside power will determine Iran's fate again. That history does not make Iran's current conduct justifiable, but it makes it legible. And in diplomacy, legibility is not optional. So, where do things stand? Here is your current status report. The ceasefire is technically holding. No major American strikes have resumed. The Islamabad talks, led by Vice President Vance with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are now underway as of April 10th. Iran confirmed its participation. Pakistan's Prime Minister has formally set the table. But the strait is not meaningfully open. Hezbollah is still firing rockets. Israel is still striking Lebanon. The death toll in Lebanon since the beginning of the conflict has exceeded 1,500 people. The Revolutionary Guard is actively working against a peace settlement, and the gap between what Washington and Tehran are describing as the terms of this deal remains enormous. America's position: Iran will not enrich uranium. All military assets remain deployed. Terms must be met in full. Tehran's apparent expectations: continued control over the strait, sanctions relief, return of frozen assets, withdrawal of American forces from the region. Those are not adjacent positions. Those are positions separated by decades of mistrust and a fundamental disagreement about who won the last 40 days. Vice President Vance, before boarding his flight to Pakistan, was direct. If the strait is not genuinely opened, the ceasefire terms are void. President Trump put it more starkly still. If the agreement falls apart, military action resumes at a scale, in his words, bigger than anything seen before. That is the backdrop against which diplomats are sitting down today in Islamabad. 14 days. That is the window. Enough time, theoretically, to resolve questions about uranium enrichment, sanctions, frozen assets, proxy groups in Lebanon, and freedom of navigation, questions that have resisted resolution for decades. A successful outcome could end the war, stabilize energy markets, reduce nuclear risk, and build a new framework for the relationship between America and Iran. A failed one could mean a resumption of conflict on a scale the region has not seen in the modern era. And all of it hinges on 33 kilometers of ocean. If this analysis is helping you make sense of a story that moves faster than most outlets can track, do this now. Hit like and subscribe to Global Conflict Feed. David here, and we are watching every development in real time. Hit the notification bell so you don't find out about a ceasefire collapse from someone else's feed. We will be here when this breaks. The Islamabad talks are happening. The strait is not open. The clock is running. We will bring you every development the moment it lands.